Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Pride edition of Writers Out Loud. My name is Liana Cusmano, and it's a pleasure to be with you here this evening and to be hosting this wonderful event. I'd like to start us off by acknowledging that the Quebec Writers Federation represents diverse individuals who live and create on traditional territories of many First Peoples. The QWF office is located in Tiohtià:ke, which is what Kanien'kehá:ka or Mohawk call Montreal. This place has and continues to be a historical gathering place for many Indigenous peoples. We're grateful to be part of a long and proud history of creating and sharing stories on these lands. Thank you to everyone for being here with us this evening for a discussion with our wonderful panelists, Helen Chau Bradley, Christopher DiRaddo, and Eli Tareq El Bechelany-Lynch. It's my pleasure to tell you a bit about each of our panelists before we start. Helen Chau Bradley is the author of Automatic Object Lessons and the upcoming Personal Attention Roleplay, which will be published by Metonymy Press in 2021. Their essays, stories, and reviews have appeared in Carte Blanche, Cosmonauts Avenue, Entropy Magazine, Maisonneuve Magazine, and elsewhere. They host the Strange Futures Book Club, a bi-monthly discussion group that focuses on BIPOC speculative fiction via Librairie Drawn Quarterly. Welcome, Helen. Thank you for being here. Christopher DiRaddo is the author of two novels, The Family Way and The Geography of Pluto. Since 2014, he has worked to create a space for LGBTQ literature in Montreal, producing and hosting the Violet Hour reading series and book club. Welcome, Chris. Thanks for joining us. And Eli Tareq El Bechelany-Lynch is a queer Arab poet living in Tiohtià:ke, unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory. Their work has appeared in the Best Canadian Poetry 2018 anthology, Guts, Carte Blanche, The Shade Journal, The New Quarterly, Arc Poetry Magazine, and elsewhere. They were longlisted for the CBC Poetry Prize in 2019. Their first book, Not Body, was published by Metonymy Press in 2020, and their upcoming book, The Good Arabs, will be published by Metonymy Press in September 2021. Welcome, Eli. Thank you for being here. Before we begin, a note to the audience, you can use the Q&A for any technical problems that you might have. It's being monitored by one of our staff members. And we do have closed captions for this event. So you see a button for that at the very bottom of your screen. You can put your questions for the panelists into the Q&A and we'll get to as many as possible later on in the event. This event will be recorded and all attendees will receive a follow-up email with a YouTube link in about 5 days. It's such an honor to be here with the three of you. I really respect all of your work, all of your bodies of work. And I'm excited to get started. Chris, your most recent novel was published this past spring. That was The Family Way. And Helen, Personal Attention Roleplay is upcoming, and Eli, The Good Arabs is also upcoming. They'll both be published this fall. I would love to know what inspired each of you to write your respective books. Chris?
Sure. Thank you, Liana. Great to be here with everyone as well. Yeah, the book, it's hard to say where inspiration comes from. I actually, my story is about a gay man who's about to turn 40 and is asked by two of his friends if he would help them start a family. And the book kind of follows that process. And that was something that I had experience in. I'd been asked as a gay man about to turn 40 to kind of do that to friends. And it kind of brought up all these feelings and emotions, situations that I never really thought that I would ever find myself in. And I found like the territory very ripe for exploration. I should say the book isn't autobiographical, but it is very much inspired by real events. And, the more that I wrote it, the more I realized that I had a lot to say also about queer family and how LGBTQ people make family and create family, because, we often have to kind of discover our family. We have to kind of discover our chosen family, the tribe that we end up, spending most of our time in our lives with. And I wanted to celebrate that as well. So much has changed in terms of like queer liberation in the last few years, in the last decade or so, or even more, like in terms of like even like rights to being able to marry or even adopt one's partner's children. But at the same time too, there are more than just these kind of like heteronormative kind of like paths ahead of you. There's many ways in which you can kind of create family, and that's something that I wanted to do with the book.
I take your point about queer family and chosen family. I think that's something that almost all of us in the community have had to contend with at one point or another. Helen, what inspired Personal Attention Roleplay?
So Personal Attention Roleplay is not a novel, it's a collection of 10 stories. And like Chris said, it's a bit hard to say where inspiration comes from, especially maybe with the short story collection, because it's not one overarching narrative. It's 10 different narratives and settings and like sets of characters that I sort of invented along the way. I think I started writing this in maybe 2019, but even when I started writing the stories, I hadn't conceived of them as a collection per se. It wasn't until Oliver and Ashley from Metonymy approached me about actually putting together a collection that I started to see it as a work that was linked to itself. But yeah, I think, you know, I was a bookseller at the Librairie Drawn Quarterly for a long time, and because of that had just like a huge access to books. So that plus the library just means that I'm a pretty avid reader, and I think a lot of the time I'm just, you know, reading other people's stories, especially older works, and in my brain as I'm reading and enjoying the story, I'm also thinking of like, how could I repurpose this type of narrative structure, or repurpose this type of like interpersonal complexity into something that feels lived in for me, if that makes sense. I think of course I write stories with some kind of audience in mind, but I think primarily I selfishly write for myself. Like I really have fun writing short stories, and I guess, yeah, maybe it's just a selfish wish to try to play with and update certain types of stories that I've read in the past.
That makes perfect sense. And especially that repurposing those narratives and pulling together from all those different other people who have been inspired and other people who have put all of their own respective selfishnesses out into the world. Eli, can you relate to any of that as pertains to the Good Arabs?
I mean, yeah, I guess with the Good Arabs, I similarly hadn't started it off as, you know, writing towards collection. I started writing different poems that appear in the Good Arabs in 2014. So it's been a long time. And so I started that, a lot of that started when I was at Concordia, kind of working through what it means to write poetry in general. And I think at first it started off when I was writing poetry. At first I was writing poetry that was really distant from myself. And then I started writing poetry, drawing from my own experience, because I felt people connected to that more. And I was able to kind of create poetry that, yeah, was more dynamic, was more interesting, was more compelling. And then the kind of third wave of, you know, working on these poems was, what does it, you know, how can I take parts of my own experience and also parts of the real world and kind of what's going on politically, in terms of like what's going on in the Arab world and what's going on kind of individually between people, and kind of how to meld the more the personal and the broader, the more political. And that was kind of, I would say, within the past 2 years, going through that collection and rethinking what I was doing with it. I kind of was able to bring in, I guess, like more texture, I would say, you know, from the real world and from what was happening. And I got really interested in writing about the garbage crisis in Lebanon, because I think the last time I was there, which I want to say it was 2016 or 2017, this massive garbage crisis happened where the garbage companies just stopped picking up garbage because they went on strike. And the government wasn't really doing anything about it. And then people were striking as well, kind of against the government for their lack of, you know, any kind of like addressing of this issue. And it was this really intense experience because I was there in the summer. And so you'd see garbage all over the place. People were like burning garbage on their own. You know, the whole country smelled like garbage. And it was like this really visceral, intense experience that I started writing about because of just the immense texture of it all. And also the immense, I think obviously the garbage crisis is symptomatic of a bigger problem. And I think what's happening in Lebanon right now shows that. But yeah, I think I'm kind of I'm going far off, but
that's okay.
Yeah, I think texture inspires me, you know, like adding texture to work and adding that kind of added layer to these different things that I'm interested in.
The very title of your collection alludes to your heritage. how does your cultural or geographical heritage influence your writing in ways that are both concrete and subtle?
Well, for the good Arabs, it's every time I say it, I'm like, I think people know, and I sound like I'm like over explaining it, but it is obviously kind of a sarcastic title. It alludes to, you know, something a bit darker. Now I'm forgetting the question. I was like thinking about the title so much.
How does your heritage influence your writing?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think
it sounds like there's texture there.
Yeah, definitely texture. But yeah, I guess, I mean, you know, like, let's say like my previous book, Not Body, it did contend with, you know, me being Arab and me being mixed race, but not in the same way. Whereas The Good Arabs really focuses on you know, experiences I've had in Lebanon, in the Arab world, like what it means to walk through the world as an Arab, but also, you know, using those personal experiences to talk about broader things. Because I think, you know, my poetry is personal, but also not just personal. Like, it, you know, the speaker isn't always me. They're, you know, I'm trying to kind of work through different ideas, and I guess it feels to me that what am I trying to say? Yeah, I feel like being Arab and being Lebanese, it's such an intrinsic part of me, and so it made sense that I was gonna kind of think through some ideas in terms of like that identity through writing a book.
Identity is something that I think so many of us as writers parse through in our writing and in the different forms that that can take. Helen, I've noticed that there are specific elements like language that appear in your writing, different languages that really add, you know, a different kind of texture, I think, sort of similar to what Eli was talking about. Why is it important to you that your heritage or your geographical heritage feature in your work?
I mean, I think I try to make an effort not to write fiction that I feel is like identity first, or like identity as an end, you know what I mean? Like I said, I do get very influenced and inspired by like the structural elements of other people's stories. And then when I'm repurposing them, I think inevitably parts of me and like the way that I grew up and like who my family is and, you know, who my community is and who my friends are certainly make their way into these narratives that I, you know, construct and manipulate. And I think that's important. I think part of the reason why I'm repurposing some of these older stories is like, I want them to feel more familiar to me and maybe more familiar to people I'm in community with. You know, a lot of these older writers, like, I don't know, like Borges or someone, you know, someone who's very classic, but has nothing to do really with like, you know, queer community in Montreal or like mixed raceness or I think it can be a fun and sort of valuable exercise for me to try to tell like a Borgesian story, for example, but like set it in like the queer music scene and have all of that sort of play out and see what happens. And I guess I just hope that that's like fun and compelling for other people as well. And you mentioned like, I guess I inject some like French into the stories just because I live in Montreal. I've lived in Montreal for a long time. I guess one example of that is that quite some time ago, I read this Russian novel called The Queue by Vladimir Sorokin, which takes place at the end of the Soviet era during Perestroika, and everybody's still waiting in these like bread lines. And the whole novel is told entirely in unattributed dialogue. It's just like random snatches of dialogue from this long, sort of surreally long line. And I thought that novel was very darkly funny and super fun. And then when the pandemic started and everybody's like I don't know if everyone remembers because it feels like such a long time ago, but during the first wave, we're all lining up for groceries, toilet paper, etc. And I was sort of like, oh, what if I kind of copied Sorokin and just did like a short story with a bunch of queers and other people from Park X, like waiting in a line where we don't name the pandemic, but we kind of know what it is and sort of see what happens with that. And that's a story that made it into the collection that I had sort of a maybe unlikely fun time writing, since it wasn't a very fun time for any of us.
It was not a fun time.
Yeah, but I guess that's an example of sort of bringing these older writers that I admire into my work and trying to make it, inhabited by people who are maybe a bit more like me, let's say.
Chris, would you like to weigh in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've written 2 books and they're both set in Montreal. When I was first starting out writing, I didn't want to set my stories anywhere. It was a weird thing. It was like, I really don't want to set it anywhere. I don't want to kind of like talk about a certain part of town or a certain store or a certain coffee shop. I don't know why. It was just kind of like, I want it to be just like anywhere. But then, that was kind of a mistake because like the moment I tapped into kind of the city that I live in, all of a sudden these floodgates opened and I had a lot more to say and I was inspired a lot by what was around me. You may not be able to tell this, but I'm actually coming to you from my childhood bedroom. That's my rent poster over here. And there's not really much on the wall. There is the crucifix over here as well. So
you need rent and you need the crucifix. That's all you need in your childhood bedroom.
Exactly. And I'm kind of here because so I grew up in St. Hubert, which is a suburb of Montreal. And that's really going to inspire my next work. I don't really see a lot of stories set in the suburbs of Montreal. And I can't stop writing while I'm here. It's interesting. Like there's just so many ghosts and there's just so many things. And even though it's like, I'm not writing about my own personal life, I could just see things a lot more here. So I feel like that's kind of where I get a lot of my inspiration from. It is my life. It's the city that I live in. It's my environment. It's my past. But I allow myself like free reign to completely invent everything too. I think we're very lucky to live in Montreal and to live in Quebec. There's just such a great confluence of different cultures, and there's so many stories that can kind of be told. So I don't know if I'll ever set a story I write anywhere else. Maybe I will, but for the near future, I could just see down the road I can kind of see a couple more coming, and I think they're going to be set here too.
Thanks for sharing from your childhood bedroom, Chris.
Yeah.
All 3 of you have set stories in Montreal or somehow included Montreal in your writing. When you write about Montreal, about the Plateau or about the 80 Park Bus or about Park X, when you're crafting those descriptions, I'm curious about where you go in your head or where you go in the city itself to make that real. How do you make those descriptions so vivid when you're writing about the city that you live in? Helen, go ahead. And then we'll do Chris. We'll go one at a time. Everyone will speak.
Sorry. No, Chris, I like what you're saying about your being back in your childhood suburb, and it sort of bringing back a lot of memory and it making it easier to write certain details, even if they're not necessarily about you. I think with my stories that I set in Montreal, even though I currently live in Montreal, sometimes I have to go back to like a certain point in my past. I've lived in Montreal for about 15 or 16 years. So there's like a lot of different eras, you go through different eras, you live in different neighborhoods, you have different groups of friends. I have kind of like my pre-queer Montreal life when I was in my late teens and then everything else. But I had one story that it's about this young queer who is doing Meals on Wheels delivery kind of all over the city. And I used to work for Centropole Roulant, which is a food security organization that does do food delivery to all these different neighborhoods. So I didn't like physically go to the old routes that I used to do, but I definitely, it's almost like a memory palace style thing. If you like think of the routes and I would think of all the stops and like all the people who I used to deliver to. And similar to what you're saying, Chris, like I wasn't literally writing about any of those people or about myself, but I could picture the character like in front of these different buildings and in these different hallways and running up and down these staircases and like getting trapped in certain elevators and, that building at the corner of Mont-Royal and whatever. And I think that once I started picturing those old routes, even if I wasn't physically on them, then the story just came very easily. And allowed me to move through those neighborhoods in a way that hopefully reads very Montreal real.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say too that proximity to places and proximity to emotions, like I feel like it's easier to write something if you're close to it, or either close to it physically or close to it in your mind. I mean, I remember from my first book, Geography of Pluto, I wrote a lot of like, I don't say a lot of it, but like a lot of the inspiration I wrote down on cocktail napkins going to gay bars. Like I would go be at my first gay bar and I'd be like, I'd be alone. I have no one to talk to. This is before the smartphone. So when I was done checking my watch about a gazillion times because like I wanted to pretend that someone was coming to meet me, maybe they were late, I would actually maybe pick up a piece like a cocktail napkin and I would write down something that like that I found inspiring, and maybe I'll use it one day. And then when it became time to write the book, I had all these cocktail napkins with like all of these kind of like descriptions of the city and things that like just hit me in the moment. I'm like, oh, that sounds good. I'm gonna write that down. But for the family way, what was interesting, like, you know, like it was, I love maps too. So sometimes I'll look at it like a map of the city. Like I'll have a map of the city in front of my desk while I write, you know, and, you know, I decided that I was going to have my characters live on St. Denis Street. So, you know, I decided what block on St. Denis they were going to live on, what side of the street that they were going to live on, were they on the top floor, how many minutes did it take to walk from Cremazy Metro to like their home on St. Denis, and all of those things, they might have been really, really small details and maybe would be missed by someone who was reading the book. But for me, it was, you know, I don't live on St. Denis Street, but for me, it was very easy to just kind of, you know, imagine what it must be like to be this person and get up and leave the house and go to the Jean Talon market, maybe, and pick up something for dinner. And so I think all of those things, they were just very subtle things, but by kind of imbuing them a little bit in the story, it just, for people who live in Montreal, or maybe if you don't even live in Montreal, you can kind of like imagine the lives of these characters and how they kind of like live and breathe in a city. I don't know how I would write a story in Chicago. I've never been to Chicago. Like, you know, like I feel like it would be so impossible almost like for me to write a story about Chicago unless I went there and lived there for a while. You know, Google Earth can only do so much, but yeah, I don't know. And that's one of the, I don't know about you, Helen, and Eli, but like that's one of the fun things that I love about writing too, is just really kind of just imagining all of the invisible moments that the reader will never read too. Like I you know, just spending all of this time kind of creating, and then the stuff that actually doesn't even make it into the book too. It's just so much fun to kind of play make believe and play in that like world.
Eli, what are your thoughts?
I also wrote on napkins and I would put them in, like I'd write like little bits of poems on napkins, and then I would end up, because I always forget my notebook. And I don't anymore. I mostly write on the computer, but when I used to write in my notebook a bunch more, then I would put the napkins in the notebook. So like I would have to like make sure that my notebook was not gonna like fall apart, because then all these napkins would fall out and I'd lose pieces of poems. So when you were saying that, I was like, I totally forgot that I wrote on napkins until you said it. And I was like, oh yeah, I did that too. But yeah, I totally agree with you in terms of like, I do that as well, where I like I'll set up, like there's a poem called When I Lived on Acadie, which is like a street in Park X, but I've never lived on Acadie. And I'm, you know, like but I really wanted the speaker who was biking in the poem to be on this like really busy street that leads to a highway. And so for like the tension that happens in the poem, so I was like really just like sat and imagined what it would be like to like live there. And I have biked on that street, so I definitely like went back to being like, oh god, how does one, you know, like chaotically biking on a street, and that can be transplanted too, because, you know, chaotically biking on park as well. But yeah, I think like what both Helen and Chris have been saying have really spoke to me, because I similarly like kind of doing a brain map, or like really fixating on one specific detail and starting from there, or one specific location like the 80 bus, and being like, okay, what does it actually feel like to be on the 80 bus? What does it feel like to see like every queer I know just like on the bus, and like trying to read and being like, I don't want to talk to anyone today, and, like, you know, bringing in these like experiences. And once again, like I said, I love, you know, texture is like, I feel like it's such an important part of a story or a poem or a nonfiction piece. And it's the part that like gets people. It's the part that, you know, brings people who don't live in Montreal to like kind of appreciate, you know, if someone's writing about Montreal, to like really feel it and almost relate it to like their own city, or you know, the difference. And so I feel like, yeah, really like fixating on those little pieces and then writing out of that is usually how I go about it.
I love that in one of your poems, Eli, I think you described the 80 bus as like the queerest bus in Montreal. I thought, oh yeah, can confirm. You've all explored different genres in your writing. And Eli, your first collection, Not Body, combines poetry, essay, and letters. How do you decide which genre will be used to tell a given story? We've talked a little bit about sort of what inspires us from other writers and how we process our experiences. And so I'm curious about how you decide what form a story will take when you're writing it.
Do you want me to start? Is that
sure? Yes.
Well, I think the form that I'm most comfortable with is definitely poetry, and so it's often my go-to. But I really like playing with form, and even the poetry that I do write, I like to kind of mess around with it or experiment. And so for a book like Not Body, I was trying to write about disability and having fibromyalgia and being a queer person, being a trans person, all this like medical stuff. And I was like, how do I write about it in a way that what container can I find? And I think that's always the thing, like what's the container that I'll find that gives me space to both play but also restrict me enough that I'm not just throwing words and it feeling kind of all over the place. And it took me a while, but I was sometimes similarly to Helen, it comes from reading other things. And so I was reading Kay Gabriel. She's a trans woman poet from New York, and she wrote this poem that was also a letter poem, and it's in Peach Mag. And I was like, oh my God, this is so perfect. The direct address was so perfect for writing this piece, and it gave me enough closeness to the reader to kind of like bring them in, but also I feel like the letter also made it distanced, and also I was able to put in all these like different ideas and themes and thoughts that then had a container, like I wouldn't explode everywhere. And I think that's the thing, like kind of working through what best serves the idea that I'm working with, or the image, or the if I'm writing a nonfiction piece, what will best serve it, and then kind of working from there.
Helen, what about you? How do you decide whether a project will be a standalone piece or whether it'll find its way into a collection somehow? What's that process like? Deciding how to tell the story. What package is it going to be in?
I think I tend to write story by story. So, and even once I knew it was going to be a collection, I was still just writing story by story. But I mean, even short stories can take their own particular forms. Like I mentioned, I wrote a story that's entirely just in snatches of dialogue, which is like maybe a little bit unusual. It almost felt like I was writing for theater just because it was so like the dialogue had to hold the whole narrative. I think that felt correct because I was trying to display as many voices as possible in this like surreal, endless lineup. So that just kind of worked. I wrote a story that's also in the collection that I think the germ for it was that, well, I was in a rock band for a long time called Heathers with two other queers, and I wanted to write a story about, like, we can call it like toxic or entitled masculinity in the music scene, which has been a thing forever, no matter what genre you play. And I wanted to write like a real, like, I'd been reading some like intense like Japanese manga from the 70s, and I wanted to write like a dark revenge story. And I was like, well, like toxic masculinity in the music industry and like revenge seems to like go together well. And then I wanted the movement in there. So I set it on a tour. Like, so I have the band go on tour in the Northeastern US. And the way the story is told is kind of like in segments that have to do with like each like leg of the tour. And I slowly try to build the story through those segments. And then yeah, I had to think about like what it feels like to be on tour, which is very piecemeal. It's like one day you're in New York, and then the next day you're in Philly, and then the next day you're in Baltimore. You hardly have any time to settle and really figure out where you are. but you have to figure it out well enough to like play to a crowd and like navigate your way, you know, in the dark back to wherever you're staying every night. And yeah, I guess if there's, it felt like a ripe place for like revenge to kind of start bubbling and like spill over. Yeah, and then I guess like I'm working on a novel now, and I think the reason for that is because I want to try to tell something where I'm able to go into more depth with characters. You know, with a short story, you have to achieve quite a lot really fast with your characters, and I try to make them as nuanced as possible. But then I think I have some characters who I'm, you know, working with who I think need more time and space to expand. So that felt like a novel project to me.
That's fascinating. Thanks for sharing that in detail. All of us exist at the intersections of different identities. How do you negotiate your intersectionalities in your writing, Chris?
That's a good question. You know, and you know this, Liana, like I'm Italian, as are you, and it was something that it really wasn't until last year that I started to kind of consider that I had anything to say about being Italian. I think, you know, I was very much when I came out like, okay, I'm going to tell the stories about like, you know, queer men, gay men, you know, people in my cohort. But I never made my character Italian. I think I did that because I wanted to throw suspect. Like I just didn't want people to think I was writing about myself, you know, so if I make the main character Italian. But that's changed a lot in the last year or so. I was part of a documentary called Creative Spaces, which looked into being queer and Italian Canadian. And also there's this new anthology that we're both in called Here and Now, which is just out also about being queer and Italian Canadian. For me, for a long time, I didn't really feel like those two coexisted. I felt like I had to be one or the other. A lot of it had to do with just feeling I probably wouldn't have been welcome in the Italian, you know, community or Italian Canadian community because I was a queer person. And maybe, but then I realized I actually probably do have something to say. I do have something to say. And so that's really been, I think in the last year or so, transformative in terms of my own inspiration. But before that, like I have to say, like I never really thought of it in that nuanced way. So I'm very happy to be a part of these projects. And I'm really kind of hoping to, at least for the next one, just to really kind of go to a place that I've really avoided my entire life, just because it felt very uncomfortable. But now because it does feel uncomfortable, it actually feels really inspiring. So so that's how I guess I'm navigating it now.
Eli, what are your thoughts?
Can you remind me of the question?
Well, that makes sense. We went into the queer Italian Canadian space. How do you negotiate intersectionalities in your writing?
I guess for me, I think kind of similarly to what we've all been talking about, you know, there's no way that I'm going to write, even if I'm not writing personal, like things that are specifically about me that I'm not going to take from my life or take from, you know, experiences that I've had, because it feels like it has more substance. It like holds better, you know. Like Chris said, like I probably couldn't write about Chicago. I've never been to Chicago either. So I think it, you know, it's the thing that I gravitate to first. And I do try to write about things that I haven't, you know, experienced or felt, but, you know, I usually tend to go to that first. And I think because I don't feel like my identities are really separate. I think putting them together makes me feel like I have space. Like I think I did have a period where I was like, being queer and Arab felt really antagonistic, and being trans and Arab. And I think in order to find a space for myself, I had to just be like, well, this is what I am, you know, I'm like all of these things. And being all of those things together has felt really comfy and felt really good and felt like, you know, like a kind of opened up space for myself and my brain to be like, oh yeah, this makes sense. You know, I couldn't see what being queer and Arab was like, because I hadn't seen anyone else do it. But if I'm doing it, then that's what, being queer and Arab is like, which, feels simple, doesn't, or like seems simple when you say it out loud, but when you're living it, you're like, takes a while. But it just, I think writing about my intersectionalities feels like it makes sense. And also, I do feel like it's nice when I think about other people reading, other queer and trans Arabs reading my work or hearing my work, coming to readings, the people who I've like heard laugh when I read the poem Nancy Ajram made me gay, because they know who Nancy Ajram is, and like they chuckle in the background, and I'm like, great, there's another Arab in the room, and probably they're queer if they're at this space, or maybe they're not, but still, and having that connection is really fun. And so it's really nice too to like think through writing about my experiences that will then kind of touch other people in some way.
Helen, do you want to weigh in on intersections of identities?
Sure. Yeah, I sort of chuckled, Chris, when you said, I didn't want to make my characters like queer and Italian because then people might think my fiction is about me, and I really relate to that. Yeah, I think the first time I read the start of a short story I was working on at a reading, someone came up and was like, oh, that was a great essay. And I was like, oh no, it wasn't an essay, it was fiction. So it's always a danger. I hope, yeah, I'm trying to think of like who all my protagonists have been, but I think a lot of them do end up being queer Asians in some way. Like sometimes they're mixed race, sometimes they're not, and they're usually queer. Sometimes they're non-binary, sometimes they're not sure yet if they're queer, but they probably are. Yeah, I think that's just like the perspective that I'm interested in writing, whether it's like a close first person or if it's a third person, or if it's I actually have a story that's told in the we, which sort of becomes like three narrators. Yeah, I think that I am really interested in writing work that is about like queer Asian people, that is surprising, like that is not what people think when they think of like Asians in Canada, so-called Canada, what they think of when they think of like queer racialized people. Like I want the characters to like do and say like inappropriate things, or things that are like messy, uncomfortable, things that I would not do or say. I want to play with that. I think there can be a danger, like, because there is a lot of pressure on those of us who have like, capital I identities that people see, to write characters that like represent the XYZ community in a good light. And I really don't want to write like that. I don't think that does anybody any good. And yeah, ends up like probably being quite bad for those of us who live with these identities. So yeah, I think I try to make my queer Asians like as messy and sort of like embarrassing and inappropriate as possible.
I'd like to hear more about that. The idea of other people's expectations and what other people expect from, you as individuals or you as writers. So how do you reconcile those expectations or those impositions with your desire and your need to write? So Helen, you touched on, this sort of this pressure to offer a certain kind of writing or a certain perspective. But I'm also thinking about, families' expectations or the expectations of community or society writ large. How do you reconcile those two things, wanting to write and all these pressures that can act on you as individuals, as writers? Chris?
Well, I'm with you, Helen, about like, not wanting to write like the perfect character and actually kind of wanting to go in the other direction. I actually had this like piece of paper up on my desk for the longest time, and I wish I could attribute, I think it was one of my professors in university. And it said, if a writer is not offending their friends, family, and country, then they're not doing their job. And like, so I kind of keep that at like, just as like a reminder that like, I'm not doing this to make everyone love me. I'm not doing this to kind of be like the good son, or to like make everyone kind of love gay people, like that's not why I want to do this, right? Like, so if I'm afraid to kind of put sex in the book, or because I'm afraid my mom or dad's going to read it, or, you know, if I'm afraid I'm going to say something, I need that reminder to just not do that, not censor myself. I try not to think too much in advance about who's going to read it, because that's when I start freaking out a little bit. But if I have that reminder, then, like, you know, just like listen to the story, listen to its voice. It's going to tell you where to go. You'll get to the end. Then you could decide to take the sex out if you want, but you don't have to. Just keep, you know, write it for yourself, and then figure it out. So I try not to think too much about who's going to read it. I try not to think too much about juries. I try not to think too much about reviewers and stuff like that. Family, friends, just tell the story and get out of its way, and then hopefully it'll find someone who's going to want to read it.
I think a lot of us have been faced with those questions like, oh, did this really happen? Who's this person in this story? And you're sort of like, oh, geez, do I want to go there? Helen, what do you think?
Yeah, God, similarly, if I start thinking about who's going to read the story while I'm writing it, I get terrified, or the story turns out to be no good. Yeah, I think there's like a fine line. I think like people are a little bit afraid of like the way that online discourse and culture can be very bereft of nuance. And I have, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to talk about Twitter too much, but I've seen like some really terrible instances of people like really getting like taken down very hard for writing stories like from a marginalized perspective about, you know, marginalized characters that like other people on the internet just decided like was the wrong type of representation. And that if I think about that too much while I'm writing, I would probably write something like incredibly bland and boring. So yeah, I guess you kind of have to just turn off that part of your brain when you're trying to figure stuff out. And yeah, it's a little scary. Like my first book is coming out this fall, and there are lots of people in my family who have like never read anything that I've written. So yeah, there's like a bunch of sex in the book, that's for sure. Sorry, I'm rambling. I don't remember the question.
No, I mean, I think that's, we can talk more about that, about our families reading, you know, the sex scenes that we've written, but I don't know, like how far, you know, do we want to go down that trail? Do we want to go on down like into the Twitter cesspool? But I'm curious to hear, Eli, how you reconcile sort of expectations from whoever that might be, and what you want to write and how you want to write.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, like similarly to Chris and Helen, like I really can't think about who's reading at the beginning. I really have to be writing for myself and write, like, I think more and more I'm trying to write from a place of playfulness and searching. And that when I say playfulness, it doesn't mean that it has to be happy or, you know, like I can be playful in a very dark place, you know, or whichever way I'm going, but kind of starting from that, and a place where I'm like enjoying writing, or, you know, sometimes pulling my hair, but still somehow enjoying it. And then sometimes I think for me, it's a bit different in terms of poetry, because sometimes my poetry is very, you know, I have, like, I feel like sometimes people think certain poems are real and then they're not, but then some poems do take a lot from real life. And I kind of do have to make those decisions on, you know, in terms of my family. Like there was this poem that I wrote that has to do with my aunt, and it was a real experience that happened. And I kind of, you know, I like weaned it down to a very small moment. It was a short poem, but very like kind of imagistic, I would say. And it was a pretty intense experience that happened. And I decided to take it out of the book. And I had read that poem many times. It was in the book for a long time. I took it out kind of in the last couple, like in the month before the book went to print. Because in the end, I was like, you know what, I like rethinking, I don't think I actually want to do this, because I don't fully feel good about this being in the book, because her and I wouldn't be able to have a conversation where she understood where I was coming from, you know? And I think that was like kind of a decision I had to make. Whereas most of the time I, you know, like in Not Body, there's like one letter that literally says, if you're my mother, please stop reading right now. And then
That's
proceeds to
brilliant.
talk about sex. And I thought that, yeah, it was like a fun thing to add into a letter because it added to the voice, you know? And I've read that in front of her. So clearly that didn't, you know, it works better if she was reading the book. But yeah, I think similarly, I have to write, you know, from not a place of fear and a place of worry, and I write from a place of nuance, and I trust myself. Also, I think there's a thing, yeah, I think I trust myself to not be writing things that are going to hurt people. And if I do have a doubt, then I think about it. But I think for the most part, I trust that I'm coming from a place where I'm just trying to tell, you know, different stories, different feelings, different things like this. And that if I can trust myself and my intentions, that there's only, that's as far as I can go. And at that point, I have to stop worrying about what other people are going to think, because I don't know, sometimes I send a text and someone misunderstands what I'm trying to say. Like it's just the way it works. That's the way, you know, communicating works. And it's going to be even more intense when it's a, you know, a poem or a short story or a novel, and the person can't, like, you know, have a clear idea of what you're trying to do. So I think at that point I'm like, well, you know, got to throw it out there and let people read it.
You just put it out there.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. A reminder to all of our attendees that you can put questions for our panelists in the chat, and we'll be getting to them later on. Helen, Automatic Object Lessons was published in 2020. Eli, as you mentioned Not Body a few times, that came out in 2020. And Chris, your first novel, A Geography of Pluto, was published in 2014. I'm curious what each of you learned from writing your very first book and how the following experience was different. What differences did you notice? You know, if you have Chris, Family Way came out recently, Helen and Eli, you each have a book coming out this fall. What were the differences between those two experiences? Chris?
Well, I think the first one I realized I can write a book. Like that was kind of a huge like, what did I do? Because it took me 14 years to write the first book, like a long time. And, what were you saying, Eli, about playfulness? Like for me, it was just play. Like I just loved playing in this imaginary world for like 14 years, maybe not that long, but it was just really fun spending time with these characters. And maybe I knew what I was doing, maybe I didn't, maybe no one would ever publish it. But then publishing it, I was like, oh no, okay, I can do this, and maybe I can do it more quickly the next time, right? So then the next time, 7 years for the Family Way, 6 to 7 years. So I'm kind of like halving it as I go. And I learned a lot about things like plot and structure and character development. And like, I never went to school to study literature. So, for me, it was just like, I read a lot. And so I kind of had to teach myself how to tell a story. And so that's really what I learned, I think, doing it, that I could do it and that I could do it again.
Helen, do you want to weigh in?
Sure. Yeah, I can relate to that. I also never went to school for writing, and have definitely taught myself in large part through reading a lot and talking to other people, I guess, who write and who read. My first publication is actually a poetry, like an experimental poetry chapbook. So much as that was a fun experience, I don't really feel like it was a smaller project. And I don't know if I necessarily took anything from that into this project that's about to be published in the fall, just because I was already writing the stories for Personal Attention Roleplay when the chapbook came out. But I think like having finished this collection of stories, I have that similar feeling of like, oh, I can finish a book. That's cool. And now I'm writing on a novel, which of course, yeah, may or not ever be finished, may or not ever be published, but I do have that some amount of like self-belief now that I can have a writing idea and see it through to the end in some way. And I think that I learned a lot about like writing very tight scenes, because I had to do that with short fiction, and writing, sounds very workshoppy, but like writing effective dialogue is, I think, something that perhaps I would have learned if I had taken creative writing courses, but I really learned to do that like in writing short fiction, because you just can't really let people go on and on. So the story has to get somewhere. So I'm hoping to take some of that into trying to write a much longer piece of work.
Eli?
Well, actually, it's funny because I wrote The Good Arabs first, technically. So I started with The Good Arabs, and then I was talking to Ashley from Metatron about writing a book for Metatron, which usually are like slimmer collections, I would say. And so I was like, oh, a year, that feels like a good timeline, or a year and a half to write Not Body. And I already knew I had maybe like 40 pages when I kind of went into it with her. And so I had written The Good Arabs mostly while I was studying at university, and then I like went to a Banff residency, and that really preparing for the residency and like submitting the work kind of gave me a push to move the work into a more manuscript kind of space, or more refined, or like something a bit more finished. And then so then I started work on Not Body, and I started working in a studio and was just working like Monday to Friday, just continuously writing and researching. But they definitely bled into each other. So then Not Body, I was like trying to figure out how to write it, and then I scrapped the 40 pages I had and was like, let's start over anew. And when I was like really having a hard time with Not Body, I would do all this research for The Good Arabs, because I was like, oh, I really want to write about like the border between Syria and Lebanon, and the ways that that border is actually quite recent. Like it cropped up in like the 20s, the 1920s. So it's only like 100 years old, and like how that influenced the area. And so I do a bunch of research, and also researching drag queens in Lebanon and Syria when I was like bored of working on The Good Arabs, or sorry, on Not Body, and stuck in that. So they kind of like, I was like doing some like back and forth stuff. And then that project, the project, like thinking through the border, kind of infiltrated into The Good Arabs. And then I did a bunch of editing and continued writing The Good Arabs. So they kind of, I feel like just like playing around, experimenting, influenced both books, I guess, so like both books kind of continuously influenced each other. And then I was like, oh, I'm actually going to write a short story for The Good Arabs. And then I decided to do that, because why not? So in the middle of the book, there's a short story. And I think writing that, I decided I wanted to write a longer piece. So like the next thing I'm working on is a novel, but a novel that's heavily influenced by me being a poet. So they're all kind of intermeshed. Everything's like all jumbled.
I think that brings us back to the concept of play that we touched on earlier, and how even just play doesn't even necessarily have to be happy or positive, right? Like you mentioned earlier, Eli. I'd like to talk about the importance of book clubs. Helen, you host Strange Futures, and Chris, you host the Violet Hour. Why is it important to be involved with a book club? Why are they significant? Helen?
I started the book club because I was working as a bookseller at Librairie Drawn Quarterly, and they've been running book clubs for a long time as a way to, create some active community around the store. The book clubs are free. You can buy the book at a discount from the store, but you can also, borrow it from the library or borrow it from a friend. So it's a nice sort of low stakes and also low cost way of getting together with other people who really enjoy literature, or, be it like graphic novels or memoir or fiction. So mine focuses on speculative fiction specifically, and I choose writers who are BIPOC and or queer, trans, etc. So I would say, like, largely you could say speculative fiction written by voices from the margins, if you will, because I think that's the most interesting speculative fiction to read. People who, like written by people who already kind of know what apocalypse is. And I think, it's good to have like a regular crew get together. People can come in and out, but I think often with speculative fiction, because it is dealing with futures, it can be really nice to discuss it with other people. I think it can be quite heavy or overwhelming to read some of these works alone. And I think like it can be really grounding to discuss a lot of these books afterwards with some potentially like-minded people. And I think more largely, like part of the reason I keep running it is because I hope that some of these books are sort of like the cumulative effect of reading all of these books, because it's been going on for a few years now, will be that all of us who are reading them together will have more concepts about how to sort of turn the future into a less destructive direction potentially, or at least how to like survive it as the destruction continues.
That's right. As we move further and further into a state of all-encompassing collapse. Chris, tell us about the Violet Hour.
Yeah, so I hear you, Helen. I think it's extremely important to talk about issues with people, and I think people are hungry for that now. I think people want to kind of like to have conversations. I have a reading series called The Violet Hour, and one of the things that I felt was missing in that was the socialization amongst people. Like people would come, they maybe would hear their friends, and then they would like talk to their friends, and they would leave. But I like this idea of like just like bringing strangers together to actually talk and meet each other, maybe even date, which has kind of happened at my book club, I have to say. Two people now live together, which is really,
oh wow,
they moved in. I'm not going to say any names, but they moved together during the pandemic, and they met at the Violet Hour Book Club. So anyone looking for dates, maybe the next one, we meet next weekend. But I don't know, it's weird. It was transformative to me being a part of it. I just thought it would be kind of, I like reading, and it would kind of force me to read a little bit more. And I met some really wonderful people through the book club, and we read kind of like a mixture of both classic and contemporary queer work from multiple perspectives as well. So trying to pick like, every also like genres too, from like, poetry to nonfiction to fiction, in works in translation, international, Quebec, you name it. So, and I'm gonna, I didn't think that I would kind of keep it going just when I would get tired, but I haven't got tired yet. And I'm really excited that there is still an interest, and people still come out and, they want to read and they want to talk about books, which I guess as a writer, it's the dream, right? You kind of want people to read your book and then turn to someone and go, what did you think this meant? Or what, because, so I just like kind of putting that more out into the world, because maybe, maybe it'll circle around at some point too, to my work. But, that's what you want. You want readers, and you want people to feel really kind of engaged by the book. So, yeah, I'm hoping that more people do this, because it is a lot of fun, I find.
Just before we move to questions from the audience, I have one more question for all three of you, and that's your writing, Eli, Helen, Chris, as a body for all three of you can be considered a form of activism. What are your thoughts on that? And can you comment on that? Eli?
I think maybe like in an earlier time of writing, I was like, thought of writing and my own writing as a form of, part of activism. And I think these days, like in the past few years, and particularly during the pandemic, I've like really moved towards thinking of more direct action kind of work as activism, and less my work. Because I think it's a lot to put on work that's already trying to do other things as well, work that's trying to be poetry, or trying to be poetry that's not poetry, or like trying to tell a story. And I definitely, like, I think writing about my experience, whether or not I want it to be political in the world we're living, it kind of is. But I think for me, like, I've like really been more focused on, direct action stuff, reparations, a lot of mutual aid in my neighborhood during the pandemic, and like doing that kind of stuff. And, using the fact that I have like a certain amount of people who are now looking at me because I write to then share, share resources or share like GoFundMe's to be like, hey, this person needs help. Like, and now maybe 4 more people will see it rather than the 2 or whatever that saw it before. But I think when it comes to my work, more and more, I'm trying not to make it do that. I'm working on the things that interest me. And, I'm working on, like, in The Good Arabs, like I talk through anti-Blackness within the Arab community. I think through, transphobia in the Arab community. I think about racism towards Arabs, but I'm not doing it particularly as like a mode of activism. Because kind of like I was saying before, I feel people take what they want from work, especially if it's not, creative, or if it's not nonfiction, if it's not, like a book like Robin Maynard's Policing Black Lives, like that feels like the direct purpose of that book is to do that. Whereas I feel like my work is trying to do other things. And if people learn from it, I'm like, great, love that. But I guess I don't always trust that that's what's going to happen. And I think, I've been moving towards, not thinking about it that way, I guess.
Helen, what do you think?
Yeah, I think I have a pretty strong reaction against calling fiction writing activism. Like I've said, I think I write quite selfishly. I similarly, like, I do other things in my life that I could call activism, like direct action stuff, making sure to show up at protests and actions, making sure to like be involved in mutual aid in the community or my neighborhood, trying to bully politicians into defunding the police, stuff like that. I think is activism, is direct action. I don't know. People can have different opinions, but I don't really think that writing fiction is activism, and I don't think it needs to be. And I think some people's art is activism, but somehow, anyway, maybe I'll speak for myself. My fiction is not activism, and I sometimes read other people's work that I think is maybe trying too hard to like have a message, and I find often that fiction to be overly didactic and in the end not very nuanced and a little bit close to like propaganda almost, whether it's from the left or from wherever. I think when writing fiction, it's better to not try to have like a very specific political how-to vibe, I guess. And I think there are things that writers can do that can constitute, solidarity work that maybe isn't inherent in the act of writing, like donating part of the proceeds of your chapbook to an organization or whatever it is. But no, I don't think of my fiction writing as activism.
Chris?
Yeah, I kind of agree. Like, I mean, I think I really don't like books that tend to try to be very, especially fiction books. We're talking about fiction, really, like, overly preachy, and there's a lesson learned by the end of it, and like, but I do think that in the way that the personal is political, that maybe like, reading about the lives of people might have like some kind of subtle effect on certain people, right? Like if they were picking up a book, I've said this before, but like, the Family Way, like my main character, he's a gay man who's in his 40s, and I wanted to write a book that like would have been helpful to me to read in my 20s, right? Because like there was no real, I had no idea what my life was going to be like. Was it going to be lonely? Was it going to be boring? Was it like, I wasn't going to be on the same path that a lot of people around me that I went to school with was. And I kind of wanted to write a book that maybe would have been helpful to me at a young age, to kind of see how interesting life can be as an older queer man. But again, it wasn't like, I had an agenda and like, I'm going to, teach someone something by the end of it, but I'm pretty sure that like, anyway, I'm hoping that, some people might go, oh, okay, this is what it's like to be, other than myself, and I feel like, I never understood people who just read fiction that's just about themselves too, or their people. Like, it's so great to read about what like other people's experiences and lives. And I feel like that in a way is maybe political in a sense, because it does, I would hope that kind of like through that there would be change, but not that kind of like, overt kind of like, like I said, preachy, lessony kind of stuff.
A political how-to vibe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Thanks for your generous responses. We'll open it up to questions from the audience. Our first question is, are there any genres or mediums you haven't written in yet that you would consider writing in future?
I tried to turn The Family Way into a TV series. It didn't work very well.
Why not?
Well, I don't know what I'm doing.
Okay.
But I would have to say that like, I would love to learn how to do that. I actually bought a bunch of books, like how-to books. And then I was like, no. And then I spoke with a producer and they're like, it just really kind of like was kind of crushing. I'm like, why am I doing this to myself? No, I'm not going to do that. But yeah, curious about that. I'd love to write short stories, but I don't like, I don't say I don't know how, but like I have so many ideas, but it would probably take me 7 years to write a short story, just like that, and I'm intimidated by poetry. I'd love to say that I could write poetry, but like I'm going to stick with this for now, but who knows?
Eli or Helen, have you ever approached a TV producer that just crushed your miniseries dreams?
I was gonna say that I would like to write for TV or for movies. I think that would be really interesting. I'm like really interested in dialogue and the way it works, and like kind of, I like watch a lot of TV. I have been watching more movies lately, and I read a lot. I listen to a lot of audiobooks, which kind of puts me in the place of, I think I like make movies in my head or whatever. I'm also interested in like adaptation, like adapting books into either series or movies. Not necessarily my own, but other people's. Like I was like listening to the Harry Potter books recently because I like listening to them on audiobook. And I mean, whatever, obviously I was like, oh, I know that people are canceling J.K. Rowling, and I hate that she's a TERF, and I'm not going to support her new work, but sometimes I listen to the Harry Potter books anyways. But I was like thinking through them, and I was like, oh my God, I would adapt these so much better into movies, like really like full of myself being like, I could do such a better job. Like, like taking parts. I think I'm interested in taking parts of novels and, turning it into a movie so that you have that kind of restriction, and figuring out what the parts that are important to the narrative, and what parts you can kind of let go, and what parts you kind of add for texture, and like all these things. I'm kind of interested in that. So I think I would like to do that. And I'm trying to write a novel right now. So that feels like a really new thing for me.
Helen?
Yeah, I'm thinking of what genres I've written in. I was actually the lyricist for my band Heathers for many years. So was that, like, people don't really think of that as writing, but it is.
It definitely is.
You have to work quite hard to write lyrics. So I did that. Yeah, like I mainly feel comfortable writing short fiction. I did publish a poetry chapbook, which felt kind of like a weird anomaly. I still feel pretty like shaky in poetry, like it's not my language or something, but I do have a short story in the collection, which is actually the titular story, Personal Attention Roleplay, that involves somebody getting kind of like totally mesmerized by this ASMR channel. And I was talking to a friend of mine who's a sort of an experimental sound musician, and maybe like we had some preliminary like chats about trying to turn it into some kind of like really cool like audio experience, just because that's sort of the main element of ASMR that I worry kind of gets lost on the page a little bit. So yeah, sort of this fledgling idea of turning it into like almost like a soundscape or like a radio play kind of thing. I'm interested in like the audio elements of storytelling and haven't really gotten to work with that very much. But otherwise, I'm trying to write a novel, which feels very daunting. So maybe that's enough for now.
Are there any LGBTQ plus or queer authors who inspired you? And I'll tack on something extra to that. Any authors who might have been queer or who seem like they might have been queer that have inspired you?
Yeah, I'll just say a bunch of names. I was in particular in the family way, I drop a lot of like queer pop culture into the book of references to things that I grew up on. So something like Armistead Maupin, Tales of the City was probably one of the first early texts that I'd read, and I loved the everyday serial nature of the story. Again, to kind of friendships, chosen family. Also, Andrew Holloran was one of the kind of the godfathers of gay lit, and he wrote a series of books. And Dancer from the Dance is a book I probably read every 3 years or so, just through osmosis. I hope I could just get a little bit of the, that kind of skill. I also love like the mystery novels of like Sarah Waters. I think she's such an incredible writer. And I actually, you know what, I'm going to say for the earlier questions, a mystery. I would love to write a mystery novel. That's something I feel like I'd like to do one day, but again, don't know the first. I have to do a lot more research on that. Anyway, those are just a few. I could go on and on and on.
Helen?
Yeah, Renee Gladman, I guess, is like a really big writer for me. I cannot pretend to write anything like her, though I wish I could, but she's one of those writers where like if I read even like a sentence or two from one of her books, I'm just like, oh, like writing, like she's really, I don't know, she's kind of a writer's writer, I guess. She just has this sort of queer mystique to her. Maybe that's not the right term, but yeah, she's somebody who I can just like flip to a page, read a few sentences or paragraphs and sort of like feel ignited in my own like ability to create things again. I think that's really special. And well, my Instagram handle is Notes of a Crocodile, and you might know that's a reference to a important Taiwanese queer novel by the late writer Chu Miaojin, who died in the mid-90s, very young, but was like the first out lesbian, Chinese language writing Taiwanese writer, and who, yeah, I don't know if she like influences me on the level of content necessarily, but her books are just like so bizarre. And there's that whole book has all these interludes with like Derek Jarman and like a talking crocodile and all this like bizarre stuff. She really brings in a lot of like other queer references, which is a really fun way to write and it's very fun to read. And so I think of her sometimes when I'm trying to make my work more fun.
I thought of two people when you asked this question. The first one I thought of was Trish Sulla, who's she's a trans Lebanese Canadian writer, and she's also mixed, and like her white side of her family is also like distantly Irish like me. And I think when I found out about her work, I was like, what? Like so excited. And she, like I think the way Chris, you were saying that like you're writing this novel for like you when you were 20, being like, oh, this is, like this is what it's going to look like. And I think, I mean, reading her poetry, I wasn't like, this is what it's going to look like, but I was like, oh, this is possible. And there are other trans Lebanese mixed writers writing, and like I feel like she kind of made a place for me, and and her poetry is just fantastic and beautiful. And she like taught me about the ghazal, which is kind of a classically Arab or South Asian form that I really love and really love playing with. And that was like hugely inspiring. And then the other person I was thinking of is just because you were like, oh, someone who you think might have been queer. And I was like, well, Jane Austen was like so big for me as a teen. I used to write like adaptations of Jane Austen
Fan fiction.
Yeah,
Jane Austen fan fiction.
Yes,
Oh my god, I would read that.
and like modern adaptations of it. So I did like take the characters and put them in like, and I would do the thing where I was like, they live in this city, and like a city that I knew nothing about. I was like 13 trying to write about like them like flying to London for an evening or whatever. They were also like really rich and fancy. I don't know. And there were like these like, none of the main characters were queer, but all of the like side characters were. And now I'm like, I wonder why I did that.
Yeah.
But I like really loved her like dry humor and like sarcasm. And I think I like loved the idea. Like I really loved the like kind of the like the everyday and the kind of like the mannerisms of the time, and the fact that she was like fighting against kind of certain ideas for, you know, what women could do, like even being a writer, but also like what women would write. So I definitely, yeah, I like devoured all her books at like 12 or 13, which, you know, I was like in a small town trying to find something, you know, so.
We have a comment from Nigel Thomas, who says, the writers of historical fiction create settings they never lived in. The settings in two of my novels are places where I've never lived. And so that's, I think that speaks to sort of what we touched on earlier in our discussion, is all three of you write so viscerally and in such vivid detail about Montreal. And we know that, you know, Eli and Chris at the very least couldn't, you know, say they couldn't write a story set in Chicago. Helen, you know, we're not sure about you, you haven't commented on that. But I thought I would share that from Nigel, and this idea that, you know, we're constantly creating worlds that we might not necessarily have lived in. Mm-hmm. Do you, we have one question, do you have a specific routine for writing? And if there are comments on Nigel's comment, obviously, I welcome that as well.
I'm going to say, oh, sorry.
No, please.
I'm supremely disorganized when it comes to writing. I
You
wish
have
I
cocktail napkins like in a notebook.
Yeah, I wish I could say I had a routine, honestly. I wish I could say that I like sat down at a certain time every day and wrote X amount of words. And I know that some people are incredibly good at doing that. And I am terrible at it. I think it's just like, I just have to think through a story and its setting and its characters and what I want those characters to do or where I want them to arrive. I have to think about it for like months without writing anything. Like I just turn it over in my brain, like when I can't sleep at night or when I'm like, you know, on one of those pandemic walks. I'm just like thinking, and then finally at some point it's like, okay, now I'm going to try to write a draft. And that I might have been thinking about it for like 6 or 10 months before I try to draft a thing. And then once I'm ready to draft the thing, I'll probably draft it quite quickly, but there's no, man, I wish there was a routine to it, but I haven't figured it out beyond what I just described.
Eli, you had mentioned that you worked, was it 9 to 5 for a long stint, just writing?
Yeah, I think I just had a deadline and a studio, right? And so I was like, get out of your house. I had a friend who was also working in the studio, working on her graphic novel. I was like, she's going to be there. My other friend is a potter who like runs the studio. And so I was like, gotta go. I like have this amount of time and I have to do it. But otherwise I'm really sporadic and kind of all over the place. And I have to like force myself to my desk. And the one thing that helps me is picking up a book of poetry and reading a bit. And it often inspires me to start writing. And I don't know what that's going to look like for fiction, but it's kind of a surefire way to get me writing at least a little bit. But yeah, it's like either 0 to 100, you know, like really organized or really disorganized.
Yeah, for me, I'm with you, Helen, too. Like a lot of it is just it takes a while sometimes before I actually start writing anything. Like I already have the some characters for my fourth book. I haven't even read written the third one. I know names. You know, I create playlists also for characters and for books sometimes. So like, and when I want to just even think of my characters, I'll go for a walk and I'll put on the playlist. And so a lot of what I do is just kind of fill the well of like, and a lot of it is like what would have been on the cocktail napkins, like, you know, scenes or something I want to happen or, you know, characteristic of, and then I'll kind of put it all together in a place. I'm also one of those writers who loves Scrivener, which is a software that, like, I don't know, some people love to use. I love it. It just allows me to kind of like organize my thoughts in a very particular way. This like book of life right now, this is like my next project. So you can kind of see, I'll cut pictures out and I'll paste them. And I've got like different characters and I've got like their names and what they do and their backstory. I kind of build the scaffolding before I build the building, right? So it's just weird. So then when it's time to build the building, hopefully it'll be a little bit quicker. So, but I do find it very, very difficult to find the time sometimes to write. I lost my job during the pandemic last year, and it ended up being a godsend in a weird way because I got like a severance for like a few weeks, 14 weeks. So I've never succeeded in getting a Canada Council grant or any kind of grants whatsoever, but like all of a sudden I had the severance and like time to write, and I was so productive. So I was like, oh, this is what happens when you actually are able to not work and just focus on your writing. And I did get employed, thankfully, but it's to the detriment of my writing right now because it's just not happening, or it's like molasses. So but you know, when I do get the bum in the seat, and I do kind of focus, I really do love it because everything just melts away and you're just playing, you know, like playing. And I'm looking forward to being able to do that again soon.
Thanks so much to all three of you for your very detailed and generous responses, and for telling us about your work and your process and about how you borrow from the real world and put it out on the page. Helen, I like how you write selfishly. And I love how all three of you had, you know, similar perspectives, similar and unique perspectives on, you know, what does it mean to be a person who's queer, who's writing, a person who exists at these intersections, who's writing with these influences or this lived experience or this reality. So thank you very much for sharing all of that with us. Do you have any last comments?
Well, thanks so much for being our interlocutor. It's been a really fun conversation, and I think I've learned a bunch from it. So yeah, thank you all.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Liana, and thank you QWF too for putting on an event like this. I think this is probably the first queer event, correct me if I'm wrong, that the organization is kind of particularly put on. So I you know, tip my hat. Thank you very much for doing that, and appreciate all the work that everyone does.
Yeah, thanks, Liana. I feel like you definitely did such a great job, and it felt very smooth and nice. And so thank you for that. And thank you for, sorry, but for putting on the Violet Hour. I feel like it's been such an important part of like queer reading in Montreal, and I've like always loved all of the readings. So
thanks. Here's hoping we can do it again in person soon. Yeah. Thank you.
It's been such a pleasure to be your host. And it was such an honor. I've been really looking forward to it and really enjoyed it. So thank you very much. Thank you to Helen Chau Bradley, to Eli Tareq El Bechelany-Lynch, and to Chris DiRaddo for this great discussion. Thank you to QWF for producing this event. This is the third edition of the Writers Out Loud series this season. So a reminder to our audience to watch for notices of the other events on the QWF website and to keep an eye out for the link in the follow-up email that you'll receive after this evening. The recording will be posted on YouTube where everybody in the world can see it, and you'll have the link to that in a follow-up email as well. Thanks again to our panelists, and have a great night, everyone. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye.